Welcome back to another episode of the Lake Protectors podcast. This is our first episode we are filming in 2025. And this year we're going to be releasing episodes on a monthly basis. And then there will be some mini episodes throughout. So stay tuned. With us today, we have our brand new executive director of the Lake George Association, Dr. Brendan Wiltse. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we're excited to just in general have you on board. It's been a long time coming, trials, tribulations, and yet here we are. So thank you for joining us. And we want to just kind of go through the rundown today, your background, and what your hopes are for the Lake George Association. So again, welcome. And why don't we jump right in and talk about your background, where you're from, how'd you end up here?
Sure. I guess that's a long story.
Yeah. We got time.
So I grew up in Watertown, New York, Northern New York. So I'm from the region or from the area. And I always had an interest in the natural sciences and the outdoors, and spent time at Hudson Valley Community College, just south of here. Yeah. Got an associate's degree in environmental science from there. Then went to Paul Smith College, got a bachelor's degree, and eventually ended up at Queen's University up in Canada to do my PhD, which was really where I began to focus on freshwater science and conservation work.
Okay. And you've done some unique work with freshwater science.
Yeah, so I'm going to use some funky terms, but I'll explain them to everyone.
Perfect.
So
I'd ask if you didn't.
So I studied a field broadly called limnology, which is the study of freshwater ecosystems. But more specifically, I focused on a subfield called paleolimnology, which is, you can think of as the history of freshwater ecosystems.
Okay.
And the way that typically works is we take sediment cores from the bottom of lakes, which those cores and the sediments at a lake bottom capture the history of a lake ecosystem. You can think of it as sort of like pages in a book. The sediments, as they accumulate over time, the newer stuff is on the top, the older stuff is on the bottom, and it's made up of basically the dead organisms that were in the lake. So if you take a core and you look through that core, you can quite literally see what lived in the lake 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, even 10,000 years ago.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Has that ever been done on Lake George?
There have been studies on the lake, not a lot, but there have been a few.
Okay.
It's been done a lot across the Adirondack region.
Yeah.
One of the more interesting applications of this type of science was related to acid rain. Mm-hmm. So that, was affecting our region, but in the 70s and 80s, when we were beginning to understand that problem, there was a debate about whether our lakes were naturally acidic. That's what the coal-fired power plant companies were saying. It's not us. Your lakes have always been this way. And
it's their marketing.
Right. Yeah. And the challenge is no one was out measuring the pH of lakes, 100 years ago. Right. And so paleolimnology was used on many lakes, like dozens of lakes across the park. And through some modeling work, we were able to reconstruct the pH of our lakes going back hundreds, thousands of years and show that acidification is a recent phenomenon, and it's correlates and corresponds to the industrialization of the Midwest and coal-fired and other fossil fuel burning power plants that were sending emissions in our direction.
So nice try, coal plants.
Right.
But we got you. So from getting your PhD, where did you transition to after that?
Sure, yeah. So just maybe a little more about my specific PhD work. I worked at a place that's really unique and interesting in the world called the Experimental Lakes Area, which is in far northwestern Ontario.
Okay.
And it's one of the only places in the world where scientists can experimentally manipulate entire lake ecosystems. And this, this sounds really scary, and we certainly wouldn't want anyone doing this to Lake George.
No.
But there's many, many lakes in this area, like hundreds of them that are part of this experimental area. And when there's questions about acid rain or nutrients or mercury or climate change, scientists there will go and they've acidified lakes. They put acid in them to see how the system responds. They've added nutrients to understand that phosphorus is the most important limiting nutrient in our aquatic ecosystems. It's the one we're most concerned about.
Yeah.
They've put mercury in lakes and tracked it through the food web to see how it makes it into our fish. They've done a lot of that type of work over the last, I guess, 50 or 60 years now. And my work there was to use these paleo techniques to look at the reference lakes, the lakes that they're not manipulating.
Okay.
And understand how they're responding to climate change, because it's sort of shifting baseline that's occurring that's complicating our understanding of all these other problems. And the short story on many years of work on that is small boreal lakes that are very similar to our smaller water bodies here in the Adirondacks are extremely sensitive to climate change. They started changing in like 1850 to 1900. The ecology of them started shifting.
Before it was even a term.
And really in lockstep with when the global climate and the regional climate just started to shift back then. And so it's harder to understand the climate impacts here in the Adirondacks because acid rain complicates the story. They were happening kind of at the same time. So that was my background. And as I was doing that work, working on climate change specifically, I was seeing how little progress we were making on addressing that problem, as a country, as a planet, and decided I wanted to continue to do science, but I really wanted to do it in a way that was going to most directly inform the protection and management of our lake ecosystems. And so after finishing my PhD, I took a position at the Ausable River Association as their science and stewardship director.
Okay. And where's that based out of?
So that's an organization based out of Wilmington, New York.
Okay,
in the Adirondacks, right at the base of Whiteface Mountain. And their mission and the organization is really similar to the LGA in a lot of ways. They're focused on the protection of the Ausable River and its watershed instead of we're focused on Lake George and its watershed. So a little more river oriented, but they do take a whole watershed perspective. And so I did a lot of work on both the river and the lakes within the watershed. And a majority of that work was focused on road salt impacts to Mirror Lake, which is when I first met Chris Nowitzki here and learned about LGA's salt reduction work and worked in partnership with Chris for many years on that.
Mirror Lake has a really interesting story. That's where, of course, I first saw you was at the Salt Summit this year when you presented on that. And, talking about the fact that Mirror Lake just stopped turning over. So this natural process just completely halted, which is terrifying.
Yeah.
Like at an ecosystem level, at a human level, like to think of things stopping like that. And of course, relating it to Lake George, like what would the impact be? Lake George turns over twice a year if that just stopped, like on the fisheries, all of the wildlife. So
yeah, it's a day. When I first went out in Mirror Lake, it's a day as a scientist that I'll never forget because I had been studying these lakes up in Canada and how climate change is impacting them. A lot of that is about how lakes stratify and mix and are warming and what layers and how fast and all of that. So I had spent years looking at this type of data. And then I went out on Mirror Lake in May 2015 and took what we call a profile. So looking at the vertical distribution of temperature and oxygen in the lake and conductivity, which is a sort of indirect measure of the salt. And that profile showed there was very little oxygen and very high conductivity. In May, the lake should have turned over just a few weeks before. So those should have a lot of oxygen.
Yeah.
The conductivity.
Little refresh.
Right. It should have been replenished and it wasn't. And so that set off now over a decade of research and monitoring on the lake to understand how salt was impacting it. We eventually showed that we were getting basically sea level concentrations of salt running out of the stormwater system. And that water, because of the additional salt, is more dense. And so it flows along the lake bottom and settles at the bottom of the lake. And then that density gradient prevents the lake from turning over in the spring. And Mirror Lake was one of, I think, 8 or 9 lakes in the country that had this documented in the scientific literature. And so that was a distinction that Lake Placid wasn't really proud of.
I can imagine.
Yeah. They're proud of a lot of things, and they should be, the Olympic Village and all these beautiful venues and winter sports, but they didn't want to be the place that had this problem going on. And so the local highway departments and business community and residents really rallied around changing their salting practices and investing in stormwater upgrades. I mean, they spent millions of dollars to rip up Main Street. It was a big deal.
That was a long time project, spanned several years for them to get everything.
Yeah, and a lot leading up to get the money to do it, too.
Oh, I can imagine.
I think it was, over $15 million. It might have been higher than that to do that project. And so, now the lake is mixing like it should. The salt concentrations are coming down. There's more work that they need to do on their salt reduction, but they're headed in the right path.
As is everyone.
Yeah.
Do they know, or do you, is there a specific year that you know for sure the lake stopped turning over?
So, no, because this is another interesting story. The lake had been in CSLAP, the Citizen Statewide Lake Assessment, Lake George. We sponsor folks to do that out on Lake George. And for a long time, CSLAP was not measuring chloride concentrations.
Okay.
It wasn't really on their radar. And so despite the monitoring that had been going on for, they enrolled, I think, in 1998 or something, they never really knew this was happening.
Well, it also takes place throughout the summer. So at that point, you would be at least a month or two out of when turnover would be. So maybe it wouldn't be this huge red flag.
Yeah. And CSLAP mostly looks at surface water chemistry. They do a little bit of the bottom water stuff, but there is having these more in-depth monitoring programs on lakes like we were doing there, and we have the Jefferson Project here on Lake George, really gives insights that you can't always get out of, these more basic monitoring programs. And so programs like CSLAP, I think, are great to engage folks and also the first look at things. And then occasionally we need to go in and look much deeper to understand what's going on.
When did the lake start turning back over?
2019, 2020, somewhere around there. Okay. I don't know off the top of my head. It was a gradual process. I think 1 year it mixed completely, and the next year, almost, and then it started mixing completely after
4 to 5 years to do a massive ecological change and bring it back. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, I don't expect that I'll have that type of. Well, I hope I will have it here in Lake George, but we
don't have that quite of an. The Lake George that we know and love. It is still turning over. It's still in a oligotrophic lake. We're in a good spot, but that can waver, particularly with climate change and how rapidly things are changing.
Yeah.
And at the rate, I think I said yesterday, I can remember in college, my professors talking about all of these milestone things within climate change that seemed really far-fetched. And, they were 20, 30 years off, but they're happening in real time, only 10 years.
Right. Yeah. So. We're living it and observing it right now.
We're living it. Yeah. So we are fortunate to be on Lake George with a lot of agencies, governing bodies that are helping to protect it. Okay, so from Ausable River, then where did you?
So I then went to a close partner of ours at the Ausable River Association, the Adirondack Watershed Institute, which is based out of Paul Smith College. It's a program of the college. They are the largest regional water quality research and monitoring entity that's sort of covering the entire Adirondack region. And I initially came on board as a research scientist, and then was the chief scientist, and then was the executive director. And so had a couple of different roles there over the 4 years that I was there. And but my main focus there was overseeing all of their water-related research and monitoring efforts, which included hundreds of lakes across the park, a certified analytical chemistry lab, a lot of things going on. The organization also does some terrestrial work. They have a terrestrial ecologist, McKaylee Glennon, that looks at birds and how climate change is impacting them and small mammals and how development influences our wildlife populations.
Yeah.
And then the other component of that organization that's really the bulk of it is the Adirondack Watershed Institute runs the Adirondack Aquatic Invasive Species Spread Prevention Program, which is a mouthful, but that's the boat stewards across the rest of the park.
Yes. So we have our set here in Lake George run by the Park Commission, but then AWI runs every other one, right?
Yeah, it's
Across our 6 million acre park. It's pretty vast.
It's a huge operation.
Yeah.
They hire over 100 and 110 seasonal employees that are then distributed across the whole park.
Yeah.
Everywhere from the Welcome Center just south of Lake George, all the way up to Plattsburgh and, west across the park, Cranberry Lake, just all over the place.
Yeah.
Trying to intercept boats that may be transporting aquatic invasive species. And their locations are very strategic. They've been doing this now for a very long time.
Yeah.
And so one of the things they ask boaters is, where were you previously? And so with that information, you can map out how people travel around. And so those inspection stations and which launches are covered by that program are very strategic to kind of sever connections of where people are traveling so that you're intercepting boats that have the highest likelihood to have an invasive species on them and prevent their introduction into another water body.
Changing the path of what could be spreading. I remember years ago, I think this was in college, reading that I think it was over 200 Adirondack water bodies that no longer had that didn't have any invasive species, not no longer, they just at a base level did not have any or known ones. I imagine that number's changed and dropped quite significantly just by human, because it's not, humans, we can do as best as we can with these inspection stations, but there's birds and other animals that can transport. So
yeah, I don't have
just given a changing, I know. And I tried to find that number years ago too, a couple years back. And I don't know. The only thing that kept coming up was the prior number that I had found, but that was from, I think, 2005. It's probably not that high.
Yeah, but
we do live in a beautiful, semi-pristine, we're very lucky.
It is. It's higher than you would expect. Partly because when you think about the Adirondacks, so many of the water bodies are out in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, they're not accessible unless you really have the determination to walk.
Right. So the Adirondack Mountain Club and the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program for a number of years were getting people to go out in these little inflatable pack rafts in the middle of nowhere to look for invasive species. And that, they didn't find many in these remote locations. And so it is the vast majority of our lakes in the park are free of invasive species. But the ones that are at greatest threat and that have a much higher proportion of their presence are the ones that are near roads, have motorized boat launches on them.
Popular.
Right, because those are where people are visiting and moving between water bodies.
But even on Lake George, it's popular. Summertime on a Saturday, there could be 100 boats just in a 1 mile stretch. Right. It's so busy. But there's not been a new invasive discovered, aquatic invasive, since 2012, which is very impressive for the boat traffic. But in a large part, one, I think education. I think people are aware of what they have to do now before they even come, but anybody else has to go through the inspection station. And they do a great job. The boat inspectors are kind of the heroes of the summer.
Yeah, and I think people don't want invasive species. It's an easy sell to people that a slight modification in your behavior, clean, drain, dry your boat.
Right.
And you're helping to protect this water. But it's a pretty easy ask for folks.
Right.
And now that we've been communicating that message consistently for many years, decades, I think people are really internalizing it and the behavior is now normalized. And
And you can also see what some of the major ones have done. Milfoil is not going to ever be eradicated, but certainly managed. But people call it, they've got these dense beds and whatnot. So they're living it. Why would you want to contribute to that anymore?
Right.
But so now we've gotten all the way through your path to the LGA. Why did you want to come work for the LGA?
Yeah. First of all, I love Lake George, and I spent time on it when I was younger, haven't had as much opportunity to be on it lately. I've been working in other areas, but mainly because the Lake George Association's Science to Solutions model really strongly aligns with what I see as sort of my personal mission in life, which is to bridge this gap between the scientific research and then the things we need to do, the solutions to protect our freshwater ecosystems. And Lake George, has been focused on this for a long time, and there's a lot of resources and exciting things going on here. So for someone like me, it was just, a really great opportunity to come and get involved with it all.
Yeah, even the road salt reduction initiative, that was obviously huge, similar to Mirror Lake, but there's been so many strides that have been taken in the last decade to just reduce the amount of salt going into Lake George, the streams, everything that's like science to solutions.
Right. Yeah, that's a great
in
example.
Action.
Yeah.
Same thing with algae. I mean, of course, we have the tie to the Jefferson Project because we work with them as well, but they're boots on the ground, but we also have our own boots on the ground with Chris Nowitzki and Dr. Elise Buell.
Right.
So, yeah. So obviously the LGA is very exciting. What are your hopes? Like, what are you looking to accomplish here?
So like really big picture, someone that's I've worked on water bodies mostly in northeastern North America, but I did one study on a lake in East Africa and Cameroon.
Yeah.
So I can kind of say someone that's worked on lakes around the world.
Around the world. No, you can absolutely say that.
And with that perspective, our freshwater ecosystems are currently and are going to increasingly face significant challenges.
Yeah.
And Lake George, I think, is uniquely positioned. We have incredible water quality right now. Our job basically is to protect the lake as it is. I mean, there are improvements we want to see. We want to see the salt concentrations come down. We want to see, algal abundance decline a bit in the lake. I mean, there are areas where we would like to see improvement, but by and large, the water quality of Lake George is excellent, and we just need to keep it that way.
Maintain.
But there's going to be increasing pressures on the lake with climate change, and as people potentially migrate to our region, because we're going to have a very favorable environment in the future with climate change.
Coming. Yeah, I think it already has started. I think COVID led the way.
Saw some of it then,
but I have seen know of people who specifically had been living down south or in other areas that flooded often and whatnot, and have pinpointed this region to say that's where I'm going because that's pretty resistant to some. I mean, again, at surface level, it seems resistant, but we are susceptible to all of these climate.
Yeah, and we're seeing big storms and all of those
and
flooding.
Wildfires.
And we had tornadoes in the region this past summer. I mean, weird things are happening here, but weirder things are happening elsewhere and more significant natural disasters and challenges. And so it is very likely that people are going to be looking to this part of the country to, as their home in the future. And the pressures on our freshwater ecosystems are going to increase. And so I think Lake George is uniquely positioned to serve as an example of how do we sustainably develop and have our communities, integrated in and alongside such a beautiful water body like this while protecting it at the same time. And my hope is that, I think that nut has started to be cracked here already.
Yeah.
But let's crack it all the way and then help other places that don't have the resources and the opportunities that we have in Lake George to, guide their protection of their local water bodies and just show that we are a model that can be replicated and then help spread that model to other places.
Yeah, there's so many things we can control. There's, of course, external factor, like we can't control the weather. So trying to get a grasp on that. Last summer, I don't have the data. I'm sure JP does and others, but at least from my own perception, I think the lake heated up quicker than I've ever known it to.
Interesting. Yeah.
It was like 80 degrees by early July, which is kind of a breeding ground for certain invasive species that are highly adaptable and maybe wouldn't be in this area. So yeah, I think there's a lot that will change come. I mean, again, the wildfires up in Canada that bring us poor air quality, and wildfires down south of here too. There were wildfires this fall because it was so dry. It's like trying to navigate the ebb and flow of what you don't know. What you don't know is going to happen. Suddenly a tornado ripping through here is, not unheard of, but certainly not the norm. So when it happens like a couple times a summer.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's, as you mentioned earlier, we are, the phrase I like to use with folks when we have these weather anomalies that, we may not be able to explicitly tie to climate change, but we know is consistent with the pattern of climate change. So we're going to see more of those things in the future, is that you're living your climate future right now.
Yeah.
And when we've had over the last few winters, we had some really mild winters and weird temperature swings. I mean, those...
We're in one right now.
Going to be a cold one right now as we're recording this. But
even at that, I mean, we put out the other day on social media to people, like, do you think that the lake is going to freeze? And 60% said no. And I don't think they're not being pessimistic. It's just the lake hasn't frozen in the last couple of years. And even the years it does, it's only for a few days, weeks. Like, we have data going back to, I think it's either 1902 or 1908, but way back in the early 1900s, that lake would freeze for 45 days. I mean, 90 days. There's a couple years where it is so consistently frozen solid. Like, they'd land helicopters out there 10 years ago for the winter carnival. It's just not reality. The other morning I was down there and it was so cold the day before there'd been a skim, but the wind picked up and just, so I'll be interested to see if the lake freezes this year. But I don't think it will. I was a no vote.
Yeah. I mean, I've looked at lake ice.
It's gonna warm up.
Right. People ask me this question all the time, and I tell them I don't have enough knowledge of the ice record here, but I have studied lake ice on lakes all across the region and up into Canada. And I mean, we are seeing, on lakes even that do freeze consistently still every year. I mean, over the course of the last century, 2 to 3 week reduction in ice cover kind of is the average of what we're seeing on lakes. And so if you have a lake like Lake George where it was only frozen for about that period of time, now you're starting to see no ice formation on the lake. Larger lakes are seeing bigger changes. Lake Champlain's another great example. Their ice record goes back to the late 1800s, and Lake Champlain doesn't freeze very often anymore, and
that's
it
a
used
big
to freeze
lake too, though.
Yeah. These large lakes.
The whole thing would freeze. Mm-hmm. Oh, okay.
Yeah, and it doesn't. It really doesn't anymore. And I mean, it does occasionally, but it's much more likely not to freeze than it is to freeze now. But back in the early 1900s, it always froze completely.
Yeah. I think we'll get some frozen bays. I'm sure there's some, like this morning, it was like 10 below. But I don't know if the whole...
Yeah, we'll see.
The full lake, I don't know. I'm a summer person, although I'm trying to get into winter sports. And by that, I mean figure skating. So I did it once, and now it's, I want to do it every day. So what do you think, what do you see as the biggest threat to Lake George that we as the LGA and all these other organizations need to, in the future, tackle? Other than, of course, obviously climate change.
Right. I think climate change is like the threat multiplier across all these other things that the lake is facing and is challenged with. So road salt, stormwater, wastewater, invasive species would probably be the top ones. And climate change is going to influence or exacerbate every one of those in some way.
Yeah. I mean, as far as stormwater, again, there's so many organizations that are doing the most and trying to educate people, but that external factor of it's 2 p.m. on a day in July and we're getting 4 inches of rain in like an hour. So there's really only so much that can be done. But again, we're in a fortunate position to have so many boots on the ground.
Right. And I think it's, stormwater as a community really start to think creatively about, what is our goal with it? I mean, I would, the big goal I think would be like zero stormwater runoff.
Right.
I mean, that's a big ask.
That's a tall order.
But, I think we need to sort of be thinking that way in the back of our minds as we think about development and the current infrastructure on the ground, and how do we keep chipping away at getting there.
Yeah.
And that, stormwater, wastewater, climate change, I mean, those are the things that are contributing to things like harmful algal blooms that, are direct concern for the lake. So, and there's a lot of other stuff in stormwater too that we probably don't even fully know about, or we haven't researched.
But we will.
Yeah.
We will. I like that you said chipping away, though. I can't remember who had said it, but, even a small reduction, like at least it's something. It's not, just doing nothing and waiting for the bad thing. Like, you can make small improvements. A small improvement is still an improvement as opposed to nothing. Right.
Yeah. And you think about the cumulative impact of a bunch of small actions can be huge.
Absolutely.
And it's like picking up litter.
Yes.
You pick up a soda can or a piece of trash on the side of the road or the sidewalk while you're out for a walk. It seems like you're not like, oh, that's not that big of a deal, or I'm not making that big of an impact. But if everyone did that, think about how clean, our common community spaces would be. So stormwater, things that people do on their own properties, it all adds up.
It all adds up. Yeah. And education too, to like get the message out. I don't know where the message of don't be a litter bug has failed. Because people still do it, but then you have great people who then go pick it up.
Sure. Yeah. And there can be, where with littering, if some people are a little behind the 8 ball on that, others of us can be ahead of it and offset that. So, I think things like stormwater, we need leaders.
Yeah, totally.
To be an example and sort of set the pace for everyone else. And I know there's some great leaders here in the Lake George Basin, and I'm excited to get to know those folks. And
you've done a great job. Like now, working with partners and jumping right in. I think I said yesterday, you must be exhausted because the number of meetings you've had this month alone must be just exhausting. So
I think I'm averaging 7 a day
I know.
Between our staff.
And you're not even fully through that all. So
no. And that'll continue probably for months. That is a big focus of mine, is to get out and meet as many folks in the basin and and around the lake that are in some way are contributing to helping fulfill our mission as an organization. And so excited to continue to get to know all the folks in the area.
Yeah. What's your favorite part of the lake?
So I spent most of my time on the north end of the lake.
Okay.
And so if I had to pick a place, Rogers Rock would probably be one of my favorite spots. I remember when I was a kid, we used to go snorkel off of it. Yeah. And there's like little ledges underwater that the climbers, when they dropped gear, would sometimes get caught on it. And I used to swim down there and try and, pick up carabiners and belay devices and stuff, and then go probably do unsafe things with these things that have been sitting in the lakes for who knows how long. Yeah. But that's one of my favorite places.
A woman on the floating classroom once brought me, actually the lantern sits upstairs in a musket that she found.
Really?
At the right out, like at Rogers Rock.
Well, she dived. She must have been diving.
She was diving, and she brought them on the floating classroom and was like, hey, I have a musket and a lantern. Do you want them? And I said, of course. The musket ended up at Fort Ticonderoga because, like, what are we going to do with it? Sure. But the lantern sits up right up.
I'm sure there's all kinds of crazy things at the bottom.
There has to be. I mean, just in general, like, it's such a historic area. So many things happened here. Like, you go down deep enough, you're going to find something whether you want to or not.
Yeah.
But, no, there's definitely cool stuff. Did you know that there's eels in Lake George?
I didn't, but a former coworker of mine loves eels. So,
okay, we just discovered this maybe last week or the week before, absolutely spiraled into a hole of eels in Lake George. And we didn't find much, but they are up in the outlet. So just wasn't sure if you'd ever seen any.
No, but I'll have to go back to my desk and look up this now.
Yeah. We can find the picture of it, but eels freak me out. They're a little too snake-like slithery, but the fact that they're in Lake George, ecologically probably great. Like up in the outlet, that's their zone. But it's also a lot of there's an interesting article about them finding their way through plumbing fixtures.
Oh, I can imagine.
And stopping things up in Ticonderoga.
Huh.
Like blocking factories, houses.
Well, and are you familiar with lamprey?
Yes.
I mean, those are even a little
I have a sample over in our little invasive bin over there that we used to take around, but they're not in Lake George.
Right.
Thankfully, one of the ones we don't ever want to end up in Lake George. We're very fortunate that Lake George, of course, flows into Lake Champlain, but there's a 300-foot drop.
It's a big drop,
between the two. I mean, it's over a couple miles, but nothing's really gonna
make its way
up. So, yeah, I think, but alternatively, any invasive species that ends up in Lake George is likely going to find its way to Lake Champlain if it hasn't already. I think there's 51 or 52 invasives up there.
Yeah, there's quite a few.
6. So lots of work to be done. Any final thoughts? Anything you'd like to add?
Not really, no. I'm just thanks for having me on. I'm excited to be part of the team here, and
we're so excited to have you. It's been like a year of what's going on every day. But yeah, we're thankful to have you. Thank you for coming on the podcast and talking. We'll probably have you on again for various things. This is an open-ended conversation. So thank you so much, Brendan.
Thanks, Lindsay.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Have a good day, guys. We'll see you back soon. The Lake Protectors Podcast is a production of the Lake George Association. To check out the work that the LGA is doing, follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Lake George Association. You can also visit our website at lakegeorgeassociation.org. This episode was produced by Jacqueline Mignot. If you'd like to hear more, follow us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.